All right. It says we're live, so in the words of the great Art Tiber, we are live. I guess I don't know. Hello, Michael in Poland.
How's it
Hey,
going?
how's it going?
Pretty good. Oops, I can hear myself. That's a problem. All right. So this is the first episode of what? Oh my gosh, what are we calling this? Between Ballads and History. We're gonna cover.
Yes,
We're gonna look at some of the Arthurian legend. Uh,
that is the plan. I am your resident Arthurian nut. I am Michael Oden, creator writer of Elysian Fields, a little bit of mythology aficionado, and Blue brought us here to talk about mythology and history. So I'll turn this over to Poland, who's our historian guy.
Poland.
How's it going, guys?
Poland and I did a stream where we got into history, and that was so good that it sparked this idea. So thanks for being here, Poland. What's your background?
So my background is that I hang out with Blue and Michael Bancroft most days during the week. But outside of that, I have a degree in history, and I still love it, even though that's not what I'm involved with in my career at the moment. And as Blue said on one of our unboxing streams, actually, we started talking a little bit of history, a little bit of Carthage, because another one of my monikers online is Hannibal. You may see that occasionally on Twitter. It's Carthaginian conservative. So that is that's another field that I am very interested in. So when he proposed this idea of getting together with Michael Oden, who's a subject matter expert on Arthurian legend, I thought it was a great thing to get involved with, especially considering that, comic books in a lot of ways are kind of our own modern mythology. So I thought it was very appropriate.
Yeah,
Cool.
absolutely. And I think Poland. I don't even remember which was the first time that we actually got a chance to talk, but it was like I remember when this whole thing was proposed. It was we were doing the mailing list thing for Pyramid Gambit, and Blue was like, "Hey, have you talked to Poland about history yet?" And I was just like, "Huh?" And so then you got brought on, and we went back and forth, and it's honestly been just a fantastic experience. Poland and I actually had a fantastic discussion, kind of breaking down how this was going to work here about a week and a half ago, and it just went on like 6 or 7 different tangents about all sorts of different avenues of history and everything. It was an absolute blast. He really knows his stuff, but yeah. So the big main event. Well, Blue, do you want to introduce yourself? This is your show, technically.
Oh, yeah. I'm here not to be the star, but more to be the moderator. That's why they're on top. And so basically, it's
That's where he
I
likes
wanted
us.
to. Huh? I didn't catch that. Maybe it's better that way. Anyway, I'm kind of the ignorant knave here. I haven't read the Arthurian Legends, so when I first proposed this, it was for any story, and then Arthurian Legends was suggested, I think, by our probably the Arthurian nut, and then it was all right. That'll just be our first story, and I thought that it would be good to dive into the background in history that surrounded the origins of some of the stories that have really shaped Western civilization. So we'll generally address certain questions like when did the story come about, what was going on in history, large and small when it was being written, stuff like that. Why is Simon Poitier going to abandon us, even though he's so in love with Arthurian legend? Got it. No, he has a screen too. Sim,
Thanks for showing up, Sim.
Yeah, thanks for stopping by. Anyway,
Thanks for stopping by.
I thought it would be really, really good stuff to dive into. And I realized I know 2 history nuts. This would be awesome. So, the best thing I learned from an investigator, that you always track names and dates. And it's like, well, that sounds like how history's done. Let's get these guys together and see if they have any interest in doing this. And then I kind of didn't bring it up for like a month again. And then I finally got off my butt and asked Michael if he'd be interested in it. So here we are. Anyway.
Yeah, so yeah, I think that's a good way to kind of just start this off. So this episode, our plan is just to give everybody kind of a breakdown of how this is all going to work. Mm-hmm. Is that all of these stories have so much that we can talk about. So effectively, we're going to break this show down into effectively seasons. And so this first season, we're going to be doing Arthurian lore. And so this pilot episode is going to be where you should start, origins. And when you look at Arthur, it's a really interesting topic, because Arthur is this amalgamation of all these different people and stories and what have you. And so to really get an idea of how this all began is, so, the first real traces that we have of Arthur is in a story where he's not even mentioned by name. There was an account of Gildas and Baden, and I probably mispronounced Gildas there. My Welsh is not up to par.
I'm offended.
But they were found in this script called De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, and it kind of details this victory over these barbarians during sub-Roman Britain at the Battle of Baden Mount. And so this account was written about 3 centuries after the event took place. But again, there wasn't really a name then. The first time that we really start to see the name Arthur attached to anything is in 828 Annum Domini, in which or AC was it AC or CE Common Era. So Historia Britonum was where we really start to find the name of Arthur start to get its name into legend, and it credits Arthur as being that leader that we saw that was mentioned during that piece before at the Battle of Baden Mount. But what was really interesting is that Arthur wasn't really described as a king there. He was given the Latin title Dux Bellorum, which is a war commander, so it's a chief. But he fought alongside the kings of the Britons, as opposed to being the head king himself. We don't really start to see the king come into the legend until the very famous Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae, which is this very weird British version of the Aeneid almost. Like the whole idea was that you had the Trojan War happened as it did, and then Aeneas goes off from Troy, and rather than finding Italy, he finds Britain. And so it goes down from the lineage of kings, allegedly from Aeneas, going all the way down, and then you have the story of the romantic Arthur, and that's where you get the things like Avalon and the betrayal of Guinevere and all that stuff. And it's actually really interesting because I was doing research for this to make sure that I had everything polished. It was one of those things you look back, and during this, everyone knows in modern culture that Lancelot in the more modern version of the story is the one that seduces Guinevere and what have you. But in this original version, it was Mordred who had seduced Guinevere and got and tried to usurp the kingdom while Arthur was away conquesting in northern Gaul.
Okay. Well, hold on.
But yeah.
We just ran through a whole bunch of names, and I was trying to find my place on the notes you gave me.
It's right there at the tail end of Origins.
Yeah, it's at the first line. I had it under my keyboard. So
it's actually third bullet point. I had sent out a script. I go through this stuff pretty quickly, and I apologize about that, Blue. I'm not trying to confuse anyone, but
if I caught you right, okay. One of my functions, by the way, is audience ombudsman, which means I'm not just an ignorant knave. I pretend to be an ignorant knave on top of that, for the sake of the audience, to keep up with things when they start to flow too fast. And I'm new to this. I'm used to like one-on-one interviews. So okay, we were given a date of 828, and that is where the name Arthur first shows up in these accounts. But he's not a king. He's a war commander.
Yes.
Okay. And the war commander was what you said, Dux Bellorum.
Dux Bellorum is what that title is.
Okay.
And so then you start to see that shift into the kingship role through Geoffrey Monmouth, Geor. Actually, let me pull that up so I don't mess this up.
And feel free to type.
Geofrey, and then Monmouth, Monmouth, and then his piece is Historia Regum Britanniae.
Typing that into the chat for people. ANAE. Oh yeah. Okay.
So that's where you really start to see the beginnings of what we know of today as the Romantic Arthur.
Okay. And the Romantic, because it's the 828 is a really early date. I was not expecting this. So the current.
So Geoffrey Monmouth's is later than 828. I completely forgot to grab that. Give me just a second. I will pull up the date of that. The 828 date is for that History of the Kings of Britain.
So you've given us a note here that an account in that first one you named, which I typed in the chat,
1136 is when it was written.
Ah, okay. I'll pencil that in. If I had a pencil. Anyway, you told us that this early account in a name I put in the chat was De Alexio e Conquista Britanniae.
Yes.
That's an early account, but the written copies of it are from 3 centuries later.
So the thing that happened is that the first trace that we see of anything Arthurian is there is a excerpt from De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae. That is an account of battles at Gildas and Baden Mount.
Yeah.
And that that piece was written 3 centuries after the events had unfolded.
Okay.
So,
and then later in 828, it shows up again with the name Arthur attached to it.
Yes, and then in 828 you have Historia Brittonum, which is that next thing where you have the whole thing where it talks about sub-Roman, a sub-Roman Britannic leader named Arthur that was credited as leading that victory at Baden Mount.
Okay, so we have a really wide spread there, and as you say, sub-Roman, meaning this is Britain while Rome was in power. So Poland, historically, I just know grade school history here in terms of the fall of the Roman Empire. So what was going on in this spread from, let's say, the 500s through the 1100s in terms of Rome, and when did Rome actually fall?
So, people like to define things different ways.
I'm a timeline guy.
Yeah. So Rome itself, you're going to see the fall of it around the 4th to 5th century. And then you get the Franks who kind of come in afterwards. That's where you get Charlemagne and everyone else. The Carolingians, they're seen as kind of the successors to the Western Empire. And they actually end up breaking off from the East. And Charlemagne ends up becoming kind of the Western emperor for just a brief span of time. And this is all, very early on. And in regards to England itself, you have, as you might expect, several different movements of people into the area after the hegemony of Rome is really shaken after the 4th century. And so the Romans had been there really since around the time of Caesar, or a little bit after, really. So they've been there for about 400 years. So you have a real shift change that happens when it went from a Roman Celtic society that existed in what we'd call Britain today to a Anglo-Saxon Celtic society. And this is where you see a lot of the names change. And a lot of the modern names of parts of England come from this Anglo-Saxon time period, anything with Ham at the end, or or ton or ing. They all have certain meanings in the Anglo-Saxon language at the time. Ham, for instance, means farm. Ing refers to people. And so these different areas, they still carry these names today: Northumberland, Birmingham, Tottenham. So this time period is really shaping what we'd come to know as England today. And England is kind of like or Britain, I should say more precisely, the whole island is kind of a 7-layer cake in terms of culture and language. And this is also during the time when the language itself, Old English, is coming into its own and what we would start to recognize. And this is also around the time when people begin to attribute things like poems coming about, because now there's more words to actually convey, things that sound nice and pleasant to the ear. So around this time period, you get poems like Beowulf, for instance, because now they can actually articulate certain things. And when you hear it in the Old English, it actually sounds very appealing to the ear and something that people would like to read, but also like to hear orally as well. So this is all coming from the Anglo-Saxon incursion into what we know as England today, or Britain more broadly. And this is, again, around the 5th century. But referring back to what Michael was saying about Gildas, the monk who wrote about the conquest of Britain, there wasn't much known about this period because no one was writing about it. So this is why there's like that jump. So all those events from, really before the 5th and 6th century are written about afterwards. But we do know the result, and that is England is much more Anglo-Saxon as a result of what happened and what he wrote about. And that's where you start to see a lot of these stories. And what's interesting about the Arthurian legend is that there's strong indications that it was obviously an oral story that was told as an anti-Anglo-Saxon story, right? It was supposed to be a repelling of them, but then later on it gets adopted by them as well. So the Anglos tried to adopt that.
And that's also a fantastic way to tie into it, as because as you said, like there's a 3-century gap between the event and what Gildas wrote about in his account, and there's no one human lifetime that's going to span that, which leads into Arthur himself. And going into those themes, against the Saxons, against whomever you want it to be. But the big thing that you have is that Arthur is really this kind of amalgamation of a few different people. And I hope I didn't cut you off, Poland.
No, but it started, if I follow everything correctly, with in the fall of Rome, there's a conquest of England, or not a full conquest, but a battle in England by somebody, the Romans, called the Battle of Baden Mount. And that seems to be where all of this started.
Yes. And so with that, we actually have, so there are a few people that I call the men behind the myth. So it's a whole list. There's 4 people that are kind of heavily theorized as being like the main inspirations for Arthur. The first is Lucius Artorius Castus, and I'll talk about each of these guys here after we kind of list them out, because I do want you to get a chance to write them down, Blue, and make that easier for you.
I haven't worked
out. Riothamus, Ambrosius Aurelianus, and Arthur Mike Oden, I think is how that's pronounced. Again, Gaelic and Welsh, not my strongest suit, but I'm doing what I can based off of like the accent marks and what have you. So going back to man number 1, Lucius Artorius Castus, this is actually where it's theorized that the Welsh Arthur comes from. This connection was made from a historian named Kemp Malone in 1924. And so this guy, Lucius Artorius Castus, had commanded a garrison that was headquartered in at Boracum, modern day York, which is which has always been a massive fort, right?
Okay.
So he commanded a garrison of the 6th Legion Victrix for Rome, and as he was commanding a garrison up there, he was likely dealing with barbarian invaders from across the wall and what have you. That's around that time period where the might of Rome was starting to dwindle and what have you, and especially with Britain being removed from the continent, it wasn't as easy to garrison. So the big theory is that you had Lucius Artorius Castus, who is the root of the even name Arthur, and then his idea was that the Knights of the Round Table were actually Sarmatian cavalrymen that were under his command.
What's Sarmatian?
They're mercenaries.
Oh,
they're
okay.
like they were effectively they're like, correct me if I'm wrong, Poland. But they were mercenary cavalrymen come from all across the empire.
That's right.
Okay. And this is supposed to be who Arthur may have been in this year 500-ish event that wasn't recorded until later. Now,
well, actually, the year 500 event has actually been accredited to one of the later names on that list. Okay. But this guy did command, because as we established, there are so many different tales of Arthur. Mm-hmm. And they all span during this 300-year time lapse. And so the idea is that this guy had commanded a garrison up towards the northern parts of England and was dealing with barbarian invaders. And this is where the myth starts. But there is a Brito-Romantic figure that is credited with being the commander at Baden Mount that we've found, called Ambrosius Aurelianus, and we know that he was a very prominent Romano-British warlord that is speculated to have been the commander of that Battle of Baden Mount, and we have this evidence because there's a lot of evidence throughout that region of his campaigns against the Saxons. So it's either that he was the person that led that battle, or it was definitely a part of his fight against the Saxons. He might not have been there. We don't again, this is a time period where it's called the Dark Ages for a reason.
Yeah.
Right.
The lights were off and we don't know what's going on.
Yeah. This is literally a lot of us just kind of throwing darts at a board.
Mm-hmm. The church,
and hopefully it hits.
The church comes in when the church gets fully established. A lot of historical records are either rejuvenated or maintained or actually written for the first time. But there was a gap between the fall of the empire proper, Rome, and then the Catholic Church kind of come in there and filling that scholarly gap, because a lot of the records we have, are based from monks or, saints who wrote about certain things, or, other priests who had the time to do these things and were, furnished to do it as well.
Yeah. Now that I don't want to hammer too much on the Battle of Baden Mount or the year 500-ish thing, except for I have an interest in linguistics. I remember most of my history of English course, and there's this thing about the Britons, Britons, the Celts, and I forget how I wrote down this question earlier. If I had Twitter open, I could see my own notes. But the Britons, who else was they called? The Celts, and then there's the invasion of those who brought their Germanic linguistic roots from Northern Europe over into England. And I'm wondering, who are these people? I want to get my names straight and tie down who was who.
Okay.
So who was natively on the island of England or Britain?
The Celts and the Britons.
Okay, two different people groups.
Like they were the Britons were a Celtic tribe.
Okay.
So the Celtic tribes, you had the Gaul, you had the Britons, and Poland, correct me, it's the Irish, right? The Irish are the third Celtic tribe, right?
Okay.
And so the remnants of the Britons today are effectively the Scottish and the Welsh.
Yeah.
Okay.
You also hear Picts thrown around occasionally too.
Yes, they're also in there as well.
But
So-
a lot of this gets kind of fuzzy because
Mm.
you'll hear often like Celtic Britons. So Britons are like a subgroup of the Celts, but then some people use them interchangeably as well.
Mm.
But Britain is more precise language.
Okay. So then who invaded bringing Germanic linguistic roots from mainland Europe? Anyone? Or
So-
The
was it-
Saxon.
that was the
Yeah,
Saxon?
they have the Anglo. We call them collectively now the Anglo-Saxons, but they'd probably be from what would be modern day Netherlands, like the Friesland area.
Okay.
And a lot of linguistic experts, that's where they trace it back to. Is I believe it's Friesland. It's in the Netherlands, modern day Netherlands, and that's where they trace a lot of the roots back of Old English to. Is that area?
Because I
But-
noticed. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Poland.
I was just going to say around the end of the 5th century, like I said, about time you have Gildas writing about it, they already have a strong presence, and they ended up naming large portions of the country, Wessex, Sussex, Essex, I should say.
And so
Those
this-
are all Anglo names.
Yeah, Bancroft recommended for us a series called something like The Adventure of English, which you can find on YouTube. And I watched the first episode, and I noticed there were things missing from it that I kind of remembered. And one of which was, how did English and German have a common root? Because when I learned German, I noticed, oh, this is just English without the French and Spanish in it. So I know that's kind of weird. But then you add on all the very specific what do they call endings on your adjectives and whatnot, so you can speak in a word order where word order is less of the syntax and the endings added to words are more of the syntax, so you can keep your number, gender, and object type, direct or indirect objects, all straight. And that's why in English we can put something at the beginning of a sentence for emphasis, just like in German. Like if I'd said I am your father, but I want to emphasize your father, I'd say deine Vater bin ich instead of ich bin deine Vater, like that.
Yeah.
So sorry, I was thinking about Star Wars for some reason. I have no idea.
You're
why.
all good.
So,
Place to be.
so anyway, but then we also get our adverb order that's the same as German, with the major adverbs being time, reason, manner, and place, and that's the order they go in. So we have that in common with German, and then you just throw in a bunch of Latin terms, and you get modern English after some digestion. So I've been kind of interested with who was who, and it's the Saxons, you're saying, who were invading, and then the Saxons were invading at this time around the Battle of Baden Mount.
Yes.
Okay.
And we can't really narrow it down to like just the Saxons, because again, these stories, you're gonna see their original things start being like, you had the Roman garrisons on Hadrian's Wall, and they were fighting off the Scottish invaders coming up from the north. That was the whole reason why Hadrian's Wall was built, was to separate the civilized portion of southern Britain from its northern counterpart, which had never really been settled, very similar to how Germania was on the continent.
Okay.
Right? So while Rome had pacified Britain under the reign of Augustus, by the time of Hadrian and everything, things were just getting nuts up there. So that's why they built Hadrian's Wall, was because they were having enough of a hard time handling the expansion of the empire under Trajan as is. And so then Hadrian built the wall up in the northern, to wall off the northern part of Britain, and then he reduced the size of the empire so that it could be more manageable. And that was the whole idea. And so when you have these events that started around 500 CE, the start is things like, you had the Scottish coming down from the north and what have you. But then you also have the whole thing where you had the Goth expansion, right? The Goths and Germanic tribes came from the west, being pushed out from where they were to go, and you had the Franks going into Gaul and creating effectively modern day France.
Mhm.
And then you had things like the Saxons that were taking to the seas and they were going over to England. And that's where you have the beginning of this rivalry, right? And so you have all these different people that are kind of standing up against this foreign invader, standing up against the invading barbarian. It's this. It goes into what the core theme of King Arthur. When you strip away the tales of gallantry, when you strip away the stories of knights and chivalry and what have you, the core to King Arthur myth is the struggle between civilization and chaos, right? You have Arthur. Arthur and Camelot are representations of civilization that was brought by Rome, civilization that was upheld by the Britons, etc., etc. And then the common threat every single time is what? The barbarian horde. It doesn't matter it doesn't matter who you dress them up as, whether it's the Scotch, whether it's the Pikes, whether it's the the Saxons. It doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, the barbarian and their lack of civilization is the impeding threat. And so Arthur is this light of civilization overcoming the inevitable. Uh-huh. And that's the thing that, Poland had touched on it earlier, where you had the Saxons had turned this tale into one of their own. One of the biggest points where this became a very popularized myth again was during the time of King Alfred. What was going on during Alfred's time?
Yes.
The Danish invasions of England. Arthur became a rallying cry during that time because, again, it's all about standing up to this impending chaos and holding on to the fulcrum of civilization.
Yeah, and Alfred was dubbed Alfred the Great later on. I think he's the only English monarch that actually carries that title.
You are correct.
You can call an English monarch, I guess. It's more tenuous at this point.
What year were those Danish invasions?
Goodness gracious. Poland, you'd have that better than me at this point.
That's that's going to be.
It starts with the Lindisfarne, right?
Yeah, I think that's going to be around the 8th or 7th century, if I remember correctly.
A little bit earlier.
Yeah, which is, again, right around the time that we had these stories starting to come right back up again, too. Mm-hmm. 7th, 8th century, that's 900s.
Cool.
So, again, we start to see the formation of these Arthurian stories during this time of what? The barbarian invasion.
Yep. Now, I did wind us on a big... Oh, I'm sorry, Michael, before I...
Go ahead.
Okay, because I'm going to jump away from this. Careful, I just choked on some water.
Please don't.
You jinxed me, Blue.
I'm sorry.
You son of a bitch. Oh, goodness.
Anyway, okay, so I took us on a little Saxon quest because that was my own personal interest there. So Poland, before we get back to the men behind the myth and then the reality of each date, do you have anything to throw in there more about these barbarian hordes in fact being Saxons at one point in time among others, and just any other thoughts you didn't get to spit out?
Well, I think to Michael's point, it's very interesting how the tale gets adapted and adopted, really, depending on who the governing power is in the Isles at any point. And it really speaks to the power of the myth itself. And you actually get to a point where Anglo-Saxon kings, to more ingratiate themselves to the locals, start using the name Arthur for their heirs, actually. And so, it carries a tremendous amount of weight. And it's one of these things that's really woven into England's history, much like the robust language that's layered with, Germanic, Celtic, Latin, and then eventually French with the Norman invasion in 1066. This is also the way the Arthurian legend goes. As the language builds up, the Arthurian legend also, during all these same phases, gets layers added to it, and it gets adopted and used in different ways till eventually you have what Michael was talking about earlier. You have like this almost Renaissance like tale with knights in shining armor and, you know, damsels in distress, and it has a very like Victorian spin on it almost. So
Yeah, you add in characters like Lancelot for complete and utter self-indulgence. French. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Sorry, the French.
Exactly.
Name?
Exactly, but at its root, like Michael's saying, because of the really contentious history of England, even up until this point, because, you know, this is still very early on.
Mhm.
You have to think about, you know, they were invaded by the Romans and the Anglo-Saxons, and then throughout up until 1066, you had a huge Norse Viking issue as well, the Danes, that the Saxons were repelling, and eventually you get to the Battle of the Three Kings with Harold and William and the other Harold, I believe, if I remember correctly.
The other one.
Yes. So, you know, there is this constant struggle over the Isle itself. So even up until this very early period, there's this theme of repelling an invader and wanting to maintain your national sovereignty. And you can still see that in the English identity up until this very day.
Yeah, and it carries like that contention for the British Isle carries on well beyond that. The 100 Years' War is literally a pissing contest between England and France over who's supposed to be ruling who. Like the English consider themselves to be of the line of Norman kings. The French consider England to be their right as the inheritors of the line of Norman kings. So it's like it's this giant back and forth, and that's why they hate each other so much.
That can't be the only reason. I can think of a few.
It's a pretty big factor of it, but like that's the big thing is, again, and you know, you look at these things, and of course you know, you add on the, like what I had jokingly mentioned before, but you have on the add-on of characters like Lancelot by the French, who is literally like, what if we took this King Arthur story and then made a knight more cool than King Arthur? It all goes into that. And it's really interesting to take a look at, because as I said, you know, these stories become more romanticized as they get pushed forward, but the core to them always stays the same. Who are the people that Arthur is fighting? Barbarians. It doesn't matter who you dress them up as. It's always the thing that brings Arthur to power is there is discord throughout England because there hasn't been a strong monarch to unite all the warlords. And so when he does the trial of the Sword and the Stone, which we won't go into much today because that's a whole other episode in and of itself.
Oh, yeah.
But when he does that thing, or whatever thing that they have to have Arthur come to power, he unites all of them against the impending threat of barbarians, of chaos. It is civilization versus chaos. That is the struggle of King Arthur.
So let's get back. That brings me back around. I don't know why, to people. And you have 4 proposed people who may be Arthur. Yeah. We talked a little bit about the first one of Lucius Artorius Castus. I typed his name in the chat earlier. Whoa, the chat stopped. I think my computer's broken. Anyway,
or everyone's just lurking.
Yeah, it's okay. Everybody just chill. It's okay.
So we had talked a bit about Lucius Artorius Castus, and we touched on Ambrosius Aurelianus. There's not a whole lot that we know about either of these guys outside of, you know, Castus had a brief stint in Britain and ended up holding a governorship in Eastern Europe by the time of his death. And then
I'm a timeline guy, so do we have years for these guys? Potential years within a range, and then
I should. That's something that I'll definitely have for next time.
Okay,
but yeah,
it's hard to pin down because, like I said, a lot of this is not exactly recorded. But if you're talking about Ambrosius, that's going to be your 5th century timeline again. So you're talking about the 400 AD. And then Lucius himself, I assume, would be before that time.
Yeah, no, like you're talking about second, third centuries.
Yeah.
Which is right before the fall of the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like he started off as a centurion in like Syria.
Mhm.
Yeah, because all throughout the 400s, the entire empire is recoiling and dealing with the collapse. But, it's like rippling out and fracturing in its various parts. So every part of the empire is dealing with it in different ways.
But yeah, so that's what we have from that. And we honestly don't know enough about Ambrosius to really talk too much about him unless you have more information than I do, Poland. But like everything that I was pulling up on him was very minimal as far as dates and everything was concerned, because he's a figure that we've been learning more about relatively recently, like within the past like 20, 30 years, the past century rather, actually. Like
that's
1920s.
Yeah, he's a relatively newcomer to the Arthurian discussion, really.
The next person that we have the more information about, but again, it's not anything that we can really gauge based off of dates. There was Byzantine records by Jordanes called the Origin and Deeds of the Goths that talked about Riothamus, and this is where a lot of we feel like the historians think that a lot of the stuff like the going to Avalon and everything came from. And so effectively, Riothamus is stated to be the king of the Britons during this time of the Byzantine Empire. And it was detailed that this king Riothamus was beseeched by the Byzantine emperor to quell rebellions in Armorica and northern Gaul that were that were brought about by a Germanic tribe called the Britons, different than the Britons, Brettones. And so
Britain, all right.
Yeah.
this matches up with the Arthurian myths, because there's an earlier myth. There is a whole thing where Arthur was besieged by the Byzantine emperor. When you're looking at Geoffrey Monmouth's work, Arthur goes to Gaul twice, and one of those times he's being besieged by the Byzantines to help stop this. And then it is like, as far as the Avalon myth, he was dealing with Germanic tribes in Deol, and was mortally wounded in that battle, and was carried back to a Burgundian town where he would eventually succumb to the wounds. And this town was called Avalon with 2 L's as opposed to the 1, and that's near modern day Bruges.
Now you mentioned 2 L's instead of 1. The Dead Sea Scrolls, people pulled out as well, okay. If you ever find those people who say that you can put the Old Testament on a grid and find codes in it, no, because there are too many spelling errors in it, in terms of somebody
Correct.
using 2 consonants in a row instead of 1, like Steven with 2 V's, or PH. I'm using English examples instead of Hebrew. So is there really a significance to Avalon with 1 L versus 2?
I think that potentially, because like you have to realize that in a lot of history, even back in this time, there was a poetic lilt to things, right? And so there was this general, like, you look at things like, for instance, you look at the Herodotus's Persian Wars, right? And Herodotus is considered the father of history. Okay. Herodotus wasn't alive during the Persian Wars, especially not during like Marathon or Thermopylae or what have you. Most of that stuff is based off of hearsay and everything. Things have been built up over time. Again, these stories have been told for hundreds of years by the time we actually start getting any of these records being put down. And so when these stories get told, and you're some ignorant bumtrot farmer that's just passing the word around and paying telephone, and you say, oh yeah, he got injured and was taken to Avalon, and they're like, well, what's Avalon?
Right.
Oh, Realm of Fairies. Fuck it, why not? And that becomes ingrained in the myth and in the story. Like I don't think that it's a whole thing of, you know, oh well, this definitely did that, or like there's so much that again we don't know. This is literally throwing darts blind at a crossboard and at a dartboard and hoping that you hit. But like there are enough things that add up here where it's like, you know, some ignorant farmer in England isn't going to know where Avalon is in modern day Belgium. So like you don't really have those answers, but you want to know what sounds cool. The fairies are a very big part of are a very big part of Celtic and British folklore. Realm of the Fairies.
Sure.
Arthur has gone there to heal, and at some point he will come back and he will become the once and future king. These are the things that this poeticism that gets added into history
Almost poisons it. Well, we don't want to neglect Royalthemes and before Arthur Mac Oden, which I don't know if that's how you say all those accent marks.
Arthur Mac Oden,
Yeah,
I believe is how that's pronounced. And so we talked about Riothamus is the one that, again, you know, that's where we feel that's where it's theorized that the whole Avalon myth comes from, and a lot of his accounts from the Byzantine origin and deeds of the Goths kind of match up with. Now, Arthur Mac Oden was an Irish prince of the province in western Scotland called Dalriada. And he operated between Hadrian's Wall and the Antonine Wall, leading and led a war against the Picts in Northumbria. So the timeline that he was operating in doesn't really mix with what is considered classical Arthur, but his influence again is definitely felt there. Like you have a somewhat similar setting, and Arthur became this myth that was accepted across the entirety of the British Isles, and everyone kind of had their own version of it. So like he plays his part. It's not as big as any of the others, but it's still there.
All right, I don't even know what to ask you now, Poland.
When
we're
well,
and to correct your spell, I noticed that you put his name in there.
Yeah,
it's Artuir is Artuir, Mac, and then space capital Aedan.
Yeah, I put an S by accident. Sorry, guys. Poland, you were going to say.
I was going to say that Jeffrey's account is largely considered to be fictitious at this point. While we were talking about Gildas earlier, the monk who wrote about the earlier kind of Saxon invasion period, his work's considered to be more historical, while Jeffrey's is considered now to be largely fictitious because he's writing about other mythical kings as well.
It's literally a weird version of the Aeneid. It's the best way to put it. I was reading it and I was like, huh.
Yeah, because it is called the Historia Regime of Britannia, or the history of regimes in Britain. And so it's a little misleading, but yeah, it's a largely fictitious thing. It was written during the reign of Henry I of England. And it was this is when you're in the fully Norman period of England as well. So after the Battle of Hastings and after the Norman invasion of 1066. And, this is really more of going back and a retelling of a lot of history of England and kind of glorifying it, because now the Normans are trying to establish this national identity, because up until this point that didn't really exist on the island. Other than maybe during the Roman period, but even then they were very isolated. And this is where you start to get things like Merlin, and then a little bit later on, as Michael hinted at, you get the abhorrent Lancelot edition. So But this is where you get some of those right. This is where you start to get some of those more fantastical elements introduced during this time period.
And that's correct. Merlin first appears in Monmouth's History of British Kings, and you know, it is very much one of those things. I would liken its writing to what Augustus did with Virgil for like literally, it's Britain's version of the Aeneid. It's give us our own epic. Like, granted, this wasn't during a time where these people necessarily had access to things like the Iliad and the Odyssey, because you had that massive loss of information, what have you, that you didn't really see resurge around there until the Renaissance and the 1400s.
Yeah, and this would be the 12th century, early 12th century.
Early. So yeah, 13. My apologies. But like, point is, you don't see that there, but like, it's definitely a whole thing of, well, I want an epic story about Britain. Figure something out.
Yeah, and this is also where you get characters such as Lear, Cymbeline, and a few other like mythical monarchs of the time.
Yeah,
and popular names too. I mean, we've all heard at least Lear with some passing familiarity, but it really is like the epic of England.
And this is the correct me if I'm wrong. No, sorry, correct me. Is stories like this get changed, don't they? Just because the populace wants their own myths more than it's a top-down give me a story, correct?
And yes, but I don't I don't think that it's done to that degree on like an official level. Like it's one of those things where you even look back at things like the Iliad and the Odyssey. So like the Iliad, the version that we have, is just one translation of it. It used to be a whole thing where like the places that all of these heroes were from would be rotated. So like with the exception of the Trojan Trojan antagonist, like all the badass Greek war chiefs, their origin places would get swapped around. So like one story, Agamemnon wouldn't be in Mycenae, he'd be from Athens, or Achilles wouldn't be from Thea, he'd be from Sparta. And it would all get like kind of tossed around in these festivals. And that's the same thing with Arthurian myth as well. And that's why you have these at times very conflicting themes, where you have this very Christian environment, but then you're dealing with very pagan elements, like looking at things like Excalibur and the Lady of the Lake and all these things that delve very deep into the lore of the Fae. But then you're also having these people claim to be beacons of Christendom.
Mm-hmm. Kind of weird. This harkens back to something I think Poland said earlier. I'm dyslexic, so I might be mixing the two of you up. But he mentioned that one version of an Arthurian legend that popped up actually flipped sides against the Briton. What? I think I misread.
It wasn't that it flipped against the Britons. It was that the Saxons used it as a way to inspire people, despite the fact that it is a very anti-Saxon story traditionally.
Yeah, most people regard the roots of it as being against the Saxons. Like the inspiration for it, I guess you could say, was in its very first iteration, the Saxons were the baddies, right? Mm-hmm. They were the ones coming in and disrupting the what would you call it, the Britain Romania hegemony at the time. Instead of like Greco-Roman, it would be British Roman.
Britanno-Roman.
Yeah, Britanno-Roman. Whatever sounds the most elegant, right?
Disrupting the Pax Britannia. Yeah.
Yeah. So they were the original ones, but about the time you get to Alfred in the 8th century, and he became Alfred the Great. He became the defender of what people regarded as England at the time. You start to see an adaptation of this as a tale against now the Danes. And now the Danes are the baddies. And then eventually, the Normans get their turn. Although that was so swift that I don't think that really had any staying power. Then later on, you get all these mythical elements introduced in the 12th century, like we were talking about a second ago, during the reign of Henry I. And that's really more of a solidifying of a national identity. It's like, oh, here's this tale that's been handed down all the way from the oral stories of the Celts now to the Norman kings, and the Norman kings wanting to demonstrate that they are connected to their people. It is in their best interest to say, yes, we also care about Arthur. This is something that is of interest to us. And then they started recording new versions of it as well.
Mm-hmm. But in those versions, in the certain versions where it's used to rile up against the Brits, it's more like victimhood propaganda, for lack of a better term.
I mean, it is what it's one of those things where Arthur has this beauty to it, but I mean, at the end of the day, like a lot of stories and a lot of versions of history, it was propagandized. It was used to sway certain things. I mean, like, you know, you look at things like Herodotus, you look at all of this stuff, even when you're looking at like Herodotus's accounts of the Peloponnesian War are filled with a whole bunch of anti-Spartan rhetoric. Because what was going on? There was a war between Athens and Sparta. Herodotus is an Athenian. He's not going to be bashing the home team. And so like again, it is one of those things where there is a lens that you have to look that you're getting to look at this through, and it might not be the most accurate lens, but it's the version of the story that we have, because unfortunately we don't have records from that time. People stopped recording things. There is this whole thing that happened at the fall of Rome. You had this resurgence in the old Britannic identities, and Druids started to come back and everything like that. And up until Rome, history wasn't recorded in the standard way. It was recorded through oral tradition. It was recorded. You had Druids that had kept up with the local traditions and local histories and everything like that. And then Rome killed all the Druids when they came in there, because they wouldn't stop inciting rebellion. And then once Rome left, you had this resurgence of Druidism, and you had this resurgence of the pagan identities, and Christianity kind of went away, and then it came back, and then that's when you start getting things recorded again. Like it's just one of those things where we're honestly just in the dark about, and the Arthurian stories are fantastic. They're great escape, and they're filled with beautiful poetry. But like at the end of the day, using them as anything other than that, you're not getting accurate representations of anything.
Oh no!
You'll find a more accurate representation of a quote unquote Arthur inspired England in a Bernard Cornwell historical fiction novel than you will in Geoffrey Monmouth's history of British kings.
But we can glean some things about the attitudes, and being able to now go back and kind of trace the different phases of the legend and peel back some layers of the onion. You can see how it was adapting to a changing England, really, and a changing Britain, more largely. And what is inexorably tied to England is its national identity, and so goes the legend of King Arthur. Those two, I think, are interwoven in that way, because while Arthur is always about, striving for a higher ideal and repelling, foreign invaders and establishing sovereignty, so goes the English identity as well. So I think while you can't glean much historically from the legends itself, as in the actual words and events and whatnot, it can give you some insight into what the attitudes were of the people who were occupying the Isles at the time.
Yeah, 100%.
A little bit of the culture. So we've gone through versions and potential Arthurs as far as inspiring a legend, not historical. I mean, real people in history who would inspire a legend, but the legend is not a historical account of them. We got that. As we're winding down before we before next time. So about what year, would we say that these versions started to settle down a little bit, and one of them emerged in a more solidified form that is what we could buy today? Like, I have my dad's copy of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table sitting here with me, assembled or edited by Sidney Lanier, and it's got 8 major chapters in it, or 8 books in it. So when's the earliest that we really see one of the solid versions of Arthur come around?
That would be around 1136 when Geoffrey Monmouth did the history of British kings, because that was the first time that as we said, yes, this was a highly political piece, but this was the first time that we really had the whole Arthur becomes king. He's the son of Uther Pendragon. He unites England, repels the Saxons, gets Excalibur, does this, does that, goes off and does what have you, and then has to go fight Mordred, gets fatally injured in that final battle, and gets taken off to Avalon. And so that's the first story that we see really the birth of the Arthurian myth. This is Geoffrey Monmouth's Historia. Goodness gracious.
Historia Regum Britanniae.
Yeah. Historia Regum Britanniae. Yeah.
Gee, okay. So we've hit a lot of 500 and 800. What 1100 is where I start to become aware of things better. But Poland, to close this out, what were some of the major events going on in the 1100s? Because this is going to be preview.
Where do you want us to start?
I know.
Yeah.
It's
like I need to take off my hat and pick things out.
Isn't this when the Crusades were starting?
That's right. Yeah. So you had a very fractured Europe at this time, as you might imagine, and the church was trying to get its footing as well. The Carolingian Empire had since faded, and so now you had warring monarchies, like these little fiefdoms almost. And the Pope's solution was to declare the First Crusade during this time period, and that's probably one of the more successful ones if you're to look at what it set out to do, actually. And it did briefly stop everyone from fighting, because the Norman invasion of England in 1066, that was a pretty big deal. That was a huge shift change in kind of the power balance, really, of what was going on in Western Europe at the time. Meanwhile, in the East, you still had what we know as the Eastern Empire, which had briefly tried to prop up the West during these earlier time periods we were talking about. They are coming into their own as a more Greco-Roman civilization. So they're moving, so the terms almost become interchangeable. The people inside the Eastern Empire almost see themselves as Greek in culture, but Roman as citizens. So you get this term Greco-Roman, and actually even some Eastern churches today, you'll see terms like Greek Catholic, even though they're not Greek. They're referring to culture. They're referring to the Hellenistic traditions and whatnot. And so that's what you have.
Not to be confused with Greek Orthodox.
Correct. Yeah, correct. So you have that's an identification with the culture inherited from the Hellenistic tradition. That very rich history that people like to cling on to, because much like we were discussing with the Arthurian legend, everyone wants to have a strong identity, right? With their culture, with their nation, with their kingdom. So this is where you start to see a lot of these kingdoms seeking that out. Like, this is where you start to get your proper Englands, as we would know them during the medieval period, your proper France, German. That's going to take a little while longer before you get to them. But this is where you start to see a lot of these bodies and these entities begin to actually develop into their own sovereignties as we would know them. And I mean, really, this is what's going to launch us on the trajectory towards eventually the Renaissance period and the rediscovering a lot of these artworks and whatnot. As Europe itself is starting to dust itself off, the church is establishing itself, there are records being kept, there are schools being established, cathedrals are being built. And this is really a time when everyone's picking up the pieces and trying to find their way.
Okay. So we'll leave this on a hopeless note of everything is falling apart.
Well, I was thinking, so when Poland and I had talked about this for the live shows that we do, we were thinking about seeing if anybody in the audience had any questions. So before we wrap up, let's see if there's anyone that has any comments in there asking about stuff. Let's see.
Yeah, I've had a lot of fun saying things kind of, half-assedly, just knowing that this is not going to come out right, so I'm not even going to try to make it sound smart. I'm just let you guys correct me, and it's worked. So I appreciate that. But yeah, if anybody has any questions, please throw them in now. Before we wrap up, I didn't think we'd cover this much in one day. I really didn't, in just one episode. But in future episodes, we may pre-record them so that we can just premiere them and whatnot. But do some of them live, some of them pre-recorded. I don't know how often we're going to do these, as far as every week or so. But
we'll get that ironed out. But like this has been awesome. Like this is so cool, and I Poland and I have been bouncing some ideas off each other for like future episodes for this series on Arthur in particular. We'll figure out if we're going to pre-record them and what have you, which might even be to our benefit as we can do some like severe video editing and what have you.
Joke on water. Yes, that would be good.
Yeah, and what we really want to get across with this series is that stories matter. And I think that also for all of us who have been brought together by comic books up until this point, there are things that we inherit that are somewhat intangible. And I think King Arthur really speaks to that. I mean, it wasn't written down for centuries and centuries, and eventually it manifests as this story that really captures your imagination, right? And so as we go through history, we used to call this in our history classes SFI, which is specific factual information, dates, names, places, and all that sort of thing. Like those are important. But at the end of the day, even when you're looking at actual history, it is all about constructing a narrative of some type. And that really, when you are going through and doing historical research, if you're not able to describe a narrative that you're piecing together through research and information and evidence, then people just don't find it very interesting. They find it very dry. So, as we go through these fictional stories, you may begin to see some intersection between what we're discussing in terms of the fictional stories and the actual record itself.
It's funny.
And we did get a question here. If we want to pull that up, it's from Jason Black.
Yeah, I'll get that in a sec. Just real quick. So you use the word narrative, Poland. It's funny to use that term because there are almost three uses for it. One is the philosophical sense, where it shapes a worldview, and the other is a sequence of events like historical narrative, which maybe has nothing to do with worldview. But then at the same time, we also have narrative in the fictional sense, which is really close to the historical use of it. And I just wanted to point out that we're really not using it the same as the philosophical sense, which is really popular to use nowadays. That's
right.
all. Okay, Poland, would you read Jason's question for what's his name?
Should I read it all into the mic, like all?
Yeah. Read it really
all
close.
sensual, like.
Read it like a Kiwi. So.
I don't know if I can do that. I'd like to ask if you have a real sense of Arthur's character. I see him defined by his temperance and leadership. What kind of dude was he?
I don't know if I'd agree with that. Arthur, one of the things that I really like when I delve back into Arthur is he's not very temperate. In fact, he's a man that's very much governed by his emotions, and that's what allows him to inspire. It is also his fatal flaw. He is at times very arrogant. He is he's the whole point is he's the boy king. So he makes a lot of silly decisions that are rooted in how he feels instead of tempering those feelings. like you look at things like especially when you're going, because like when you're just looking at like the base like stories of like origin and what have you, don't get a lot of it. But when you look at things in the later stories, uh you you have the story, for instance, of how he gets Excalibur. He's just gotten his ass kicked by the Sable Knight Pelennor. um Pelennor broke his original sword. He gets Excalibur. He goes, he fights Pelennor again and wins with Excalibur. And then Merlin poses him the question of, if you were to keep one between Excalibur and her sheath, which would you choose? And without even taking a second to think about it, it was like, please, Excalibur, look at it. She's brilliant. She's beautiful. She's indestructible. There's no finer edge. And he goes, well, then you are a fool, because the man who wears her sheath shall never have harm come to them. And this was a whole teaching point. Arthur is not like every hero should have a character flaw, and I think that Temperance is Arthur's. Arthur goes 100% in on everything that he does, and it's both the thing that inspires his knights, and it's also the thing that gets him killed. You know, he doesn't fight Mordred with caution. He underestimates him, and Mordred gets a lucky hit on him. You know, he consistently wants to believe in the better qualities of his half sister Morgane, and what's she do? She almost gets rid of Excalibur. She tries to get rid of Excalibur, but she doesn't have the time, so she gets rid of his sheath, which leads to him being pervious to harm. Like, he is a man governed by his emotions. I don't think I would have temperance, but leadership for sure. He's very charismatic. That was the big thing.
So is that?
I mean,
in terms of stories, what Poland said earlier about stories being reshaped for their time and use, and you mentioned it too. Here, Jason continues with that. In movies I've seen, Gargoyles TV show, he's always the archetype of a perfect king. Is that because of the? Oh, geez, I must be tired and hungry. The last thing you just said about. Oh crap! I can't remember your last words. I'm nervous. But is that because we focus on those because that's what we need?
I think so. Well, because like you look at what heroes are from a narrative standpoint, and they are the embodiment of traits that we hold value in as a society. And then you look at the King Arthur myth, and the whole thing about King Arthur is everyone thinks that Arthur's reign was a utopia. No, it was a just rule and a just time. Mm-hmm. That was the whole thing, was that there was still injustice. But the thing is that Arthur did his best to fight against that. He wasn't perfect. And so this idea of him being that perfect archetypal king that we see in modern media, I feel is way more geared towards what we feel that we need from that myth than what the myth actually was. You know, you like, because I know exactly what he's talking about with Arthur when he shows up in Gargoyles and what have you. Like he shows up and it's the whole Once and Future King storyline. He's coming back to the world, and you have the whole aspect of Arthur where when he comes back there will be a reign of prosperity that lasts eternity, kind of deal. And so they really showcase that. But like when you look at these stories, if Arthur came back to a modern day, he'd not really be celebrated. Like the way that he dealt with stuff was very good for its time, but like you think about the stuff that people need for from their governments today, and he'd just be like, no, that's not just. That's not how a just king rules. And it would be a complete different clash of ideologies. And so like there's a lot of that we kind of project because we have our own needs from our heroes for what we want to inspire us. But it's the same thing when you go and look at these older stories. They're like, Hercules isn't what is portrayed in the Disney cartoon.
No.
Hercules is a horrifically tragic figure. Yes, he does really impressive stuff, but the man murdered his children. Like, he was driven into a fit of rage by the goddess Hera, and he murdered his wife and 7 kids? Not a happy story. But again, we have this expectation from our heroes where they need, especially in today's society, where our heroes need to have this ideal life that we want. And that's not a bad thing necessarily, but it's also not authentic to who they are.
I've heard, in terms of the fiction, I've heard RJ, the guy who runs the Fourth Age, a very intelligent guy, well studied, I should say. He, Jason Black says, great answer. Thank you, by the way, Arthur Nutt. I want to call you Mike, but it says Arthur Nutt. Anyway,
it's fine. I'm gonna have this is gonna change every single time that we tackle a new mythology or new story. This is gonna be different because it's my role. My role in the show is to be the guy that knows the story.
Yeah.
So,
but what's his name? RJ put it very simply that it used to be, one of the thumbnails I took from him was, it used to be that the hero was the more virtuous and the villain was more moral and virtuous, and the villain had lower morals and virtue. And so it seems to me that what we need, as far as what shows up in our stories, to answer that need for some, is always somebody more virtuous than ourselves to look up to. Even though we might never attain it, we still need to look up to it. But I'm finding that. Anyway, Poland. Before we close out, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Unless anyone else had any questions, I was just going to say that this was a great discussion. I really enjoyed it. I haven't gone over my early English history in quite some time, so it's always fun to revisit because I find it fascinating. Like I said, it's kind of a 7-layer cake of culture, and I mean, really, I think it lends to the strength of the English culture and why eventually it would become ascendant, because it did go through so much early in its history. It was able to adopt so many things from these different invaders and whatnot. So I've always enjoyed this time period. And I think it's one that goes a little neglected a lot for the reasons that we've mentioned, because it's difficult to dive into. There's a lot of blank spots in there. And it's kind of tough, and sometimes you have to make leaps or inferences based on accounts that came much later. But I think it's a time that's really valuable because, like I was saying earlier, you see the fledgling kingdoms that begin to take shape in Europe, the fledgling church, a new order taking shape in Western Europe after the fall of Rome. So I think it's a really crucial time period and one that gets a little overlooked at times.
Oh, cool. Are there any book recommendations for a noob? Well, blatantly King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, but there are different people who have, I don't want to say translated it, but it's kind of like translating.
Different interpretations, I would call it. I mean, my personal favorites are the first King Arthur book that I ever read will probably forever be like my favorite. King Arthur and His Knights by Howard Pyle. Beautifully illustrated, phenomenally written, really brings you in on it. Thomas Mallory's Le Morte d'Arthur is also really good. And if you're looking for like a more authentic to period, one that I think does an absolutely fantastic job and is ascended to like my top 3 book series on Arthur. Bernard Cornwell's The Warlord Chronicles, which is The Winter King, Enemy of God, and Excalibur. And Enemy of God is probably my favorite book that man has ever written. And that's saying something because he's fantastic at his job.
That was a lot at once without typing. So I've got the 3 authors you named. Wait, you named 4 authors, didn't you?
And Geoffrey Chaucer also contributed to it as well. Yeah.
Geoffrey Chaucer had a whole thing. So Thomas Mallory's was L'Amour, LA space MORT D''RTUR.
Mallory is the first appearance of Lancelot, I believe, as well.
Yes, he is.
And Galahad, I believe.
Yeah, Galahad, who is Lancelot's son, but is also awesome.
Can I just leave this look at Thomas Mallory?
Yeah, you can do Thomas Mallory, and then Bernard Cornwell his series is called The Warlord Chronicles. The first book is Winter King. The second book is Enemy of God, and the third book is Excalibur.
And these are based on researched legends or
So
rewritings?
Bernard Cornwell is a British historian.
Okay.
And so what he did was he went through and did research on his book take place in a version of Britain that is very shortly deprived of the Roman Empire. There are still traces of it and everything, but it's very much steeped in that 5th century fall of the Roman Empire, resurgence of Druid paganism and everything like that. And you get a lot of these classic Arthurian stories with a bit of a more historical twist. It's a reality-based retelling. So there is quote unquote magic, but the way that it works is to these people who have no idea about modern science or anything like that, it's oh my God, what's going on? But you and me as a modern reader will be oh, I know what that is. That makes sense. And it's a cool literary device that he does. But it's absolutely fantastic. It's one of my favorite takes on Arthurian lore. And I'm crossing my fingers because allegedly one of the big primetime TV companies has got the rights to make them into a show. And I'm really hoping that they do it justice and don't screw up like how Netflix recently screwed Last Kingdom. So
cool. Well, all right. Thank you, guys. We don't want to go over 90 minutes. We don't want to wear out the audience. And I'm going to have to re-listen to this to catch a lot of the details that I missed live. Believe it or not, even when you're just a panelist and not running the stream, it is hard to catch every detail live. So I'm going to go back, but if anybody in the audience has questions for next time or whenever we can get around to questions, there's my email address in the chat. It's bluesamurai0@protonmail.com. And notice there are no underscores there in the actual email address, so it's easier to type. So anyway, you can email me questions and I'll pass them on to these two guys to juggle. And we'll pick up with the 1100s and Arthur and more of the story itself, I guess, next time, whenever that is. Yeah. So thanks for everybody being here. Poland, Michael.
Godspeed, everyone.
Thanks for tuning in.
Have a good night, everyone. Bye-bye. Oh, I clicked it twice. Okay.